Jesus was asked a direct question. He looked at the man who asked it and said nothing, not because he didn't know the answer, not because the question was beneath him, not because he was afraid. He said nothing because the answer, if he gave it, would have destroyed the very thing the question was supposed to produce. That moment is recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and most people read past it in 2 seconds, barely noticing what just happened. They are looking for what Jesus said. They miss the fact that the most important thing Jesus did in that moment was refuse to say anything at all. This is the part of Jesus' ministry that almost nobody talks about. Not his parables, not his miracles, not his healings or his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Those are the subjects of 1,000 sermons and 10,000 Bible studies. This is about the questions he refused to answer. There are at least 8 of them, documented across all 4 Gospels, often in independent accounts, which means the early church wasn't constructing this pattern. Multiple writers, writing separately, noticed the same behavior. Jesus, the man who called himself the truth, the man who said, "Ask and it will be given to you," the man who answered questions in synagogues and on hillsides and across dinner tables, sometimes looked directly at someone asking him something and gave them nothing. Not a metaphor, not a parable, not even a redirection. Silence. And here is what changes everything about those moments. The silence wasn't the same each time. Some silences were strategic, some were judicial, some were pastoral. 1. In the most haunting of all the gospel scenes was an act of mercy so radical that we have spent 2,000 years arguing about what it meant. And there is one moment, just one, where that pattern completely reverses, where Jesus, who had refused to answer kings and high priests and Pharisees, opens his mouth and answers directly, without hesitation, without parable, without a counter-question. That moment gets him killed. And when you see that, when you see the full shape of what Jesus was doing with his silences and what he chose to break them for, you realize something about the nature of God that most sermons never reach. God is not obligated to answer your questions, not because he doesn't care, not because the questions aren't important, but because some questions, when answered directly, stop the very process they're supposed to start. Some questions are not requests for information. They are tests of whether the asker is willing to follow wherever the answer leads. And God, apparently, can tell the difference. Here is everything the Gospels record about the questions Jesus refused to answer. Every silence, every counter-question, every moment where the most articulate person in a room chose not to speak. And what those silences, taken together, tell us about the nature of God and about what it means when heaven seems to give you nothing back. To understand what Jesus' silence meant, you have to understand what questions meant in first-century Jewish culture. We think of a question as a request for information. In Greco-Roman rhetorical culture, the world Jesus inhabited, the world of the Pharisees and the scribes who trained at the feet of rabbis from the age of 5, a question was a weapon. The Talmud preserves this tradition in remarkable detail. When a rabbi answered a question, he was not simply providing data. He was entering into a covenant of accountability. If you answered, you owned the answer. If your answer could be refuted, your authority could be dismantled. This is why the rabbis developed an entire genre of response that scholars call the counter-question, or in Hebrew, teshuva b'she'ela, an answer that is itself a question. It was not evasion. It was a recognized form of philosophical combat. The Greek word used in the Gospels when Jesus deploys this technique is anterotao. Anderotao. It appears in the New Testament almost exclusively in relation to Jesus. And it doesn't simply mean he asked back. It means he interrogated in return. It is the language of courtroom cross-examination, not polite conversation. When Jesus uses this technique, he is not being clever. He is being deliberate. He is taking a weapon aimed at him and redirecting it with surgical precision. But here is the thing about the counter-question strategy. It explains some of his silences. It does not explain all of them. Because some of the moments where Jesus says nothing, he doesn't ask anything back either. He just stops. He looks. He either bends down and writes something in the dust, or he stares toward the ceiling of a high priest's courtroom, or he simply lets the silence fill the room until it becomes its own kind of answer. The year is approximately 30 CE. Judea is an occupied province. The Roman prefect, a man accountable to the emperor, not to Jewish religious law, holds the power of execution. The Jewish high priesthood, accountable to Rome, not just to God, controls the temple, the economy, the calendar, and the interpretation of Torah. The tension between these two powers shapes every public conversation, because every public question carries political weight. A question asked of Jesus in public is never just a question. It is a positioning device. If Jesus says yes to the wrong question, he becomes a Roman collaborator. If he says no, he becomes a revolutionary. If he answers the question of resurrection, he takes a side in the Sadducee-Pharisee dispute that has divided Jewish religious life for generations. If he claims divine authority, he exposes himself to blasphemy charges. If he disclaims it, he loses the crowds who follow him. The questions are not traps laid by amateurs. They are constructed by men who have trained their entire lives in theological argument, who know every precedent, every escape route, every implication of every possible answer. And Jesus knows this. He knows it better than they do, which makes his silence even more remarkable, because silence, in that world, in that context, was not neutral. Silence was a declaration. If a rabbi was asked a question and refused to answer, he was communicating one of three things: contempt for the questioner, refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the question, or, most powerfully, the assertion that the question itself was built on a false foundation. The Hebrew tradition preserves this in the word shatika, silence. In certain rabbinic texts, the phrase shatika koda appears. Silence is like agreement. But there is another tradition, equally ancient. Shatika keseruv, silence as categorical refusal, as rejection not of the answer but of the entire framework. Jesus knew both traditions, and he used both. And here is the first thing you notice when you map every one of his silences across all four Gospels. They are not random. There's a pattern to who gets silence and who gets an answer. And the pattern is not what you would expect. He doesn't silence his enemies and answer his friends. The distribution is stranger than that, and far more theological. Let's start with the most famous silence, the one almost everyone knows, but almost no one has stopped to examine with real care. A woman is dragged into the temple court. The accusation is adultery. The law is clear, or seems to be. The Pharisees position her in front of Jesus and ask, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" John 8:6 records what happens next. Jesus bends down and begins writing something on the ground with his finger. He doesn't answer the question. He writes. For 2,000 years, scholars have debated what he wrote. Sins of the accusers, names, a passage from Scripture. The text doesn't say. And most commentaries spend 3 paragraphs speculating about the writing, when the real revelation is in the silence that surrounds it. The Pharisees press him, and then he stands, and he speaks. But notice what he says. "Let anyone who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." That is not an answer to the question. The question was about the law. He answered with a condition for the application of the law that no one had asked about. He redirected entirely, then he bends back down and keeps writing. This is a double silence. He refuses the question once by writing. He refuses it again by bending back down after speaking. The question was whether the law of Moses should be applied. He never answers that question directly. Not once. The men leave. And then comes the only moment in the story where Jesus speaks to the woman. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She says, "No one." And then the words every preacher quotes, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." But here is what almost every sermon misses. He is not answering the Pharisees' question, even then. The Pharisees asked about the law. Jesus never addresses the law. He addresses the woman. He redirects an entire legal proceeding into a pastoral encounter, and the law, the actual question that was asked, never receives an answer. This is not evasion. This is something else entirely. This is a demonstration that some questions, when asked with bad faith, do not deserve the dignity of engagement on their own terms. The Greek word John uses for what Jesus did on the ground is kategraphen. Kategraphen. It means to write against, or to write down as a formal record. Some early church fathers believed he was inscribing the sins of the accusers. What matters theologically is that the act of writing was a refusal to engage verbally, a physical performance of silence before a crowd that expected him to speak. Now move to a different scene. Matthew 21. Jesus has just entered Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday. The chief priests and elders come to him in the temple and ask, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" This is a direct question, a sincere question in some sense. They genuinely want to know the grounds for what he has been doing. And what does Jesus say? "I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things." John's baptism. Where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin? This is the anterotao technique, the counter-question. He doesn't answer. He asks instead. And the counter-question is perfectly constructed, because if they say, "from heaven," they have to explain why they didn't believe John. And if they say, "from humans," the crowd will turn on them, because the crowd believed John was a prophet. So they say, "We don't know." Imagine Jesus says, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Read that carefully. He ties his answer to their answer. They refuse to answer honestly. He refuses to answer at all. His silence is conditional. It is a mirror. He shows them exactly what they showed him. But here is what almost nobody discusses in this passage. The question they asked was not a trap, not originally. It was a legitimate institutional question from the established religious leadership about the credentials of a man doing extraordinary things in the center of their most sacred space. They had a right to ask, and Jesus still didn't answer it. That matters, because it means the counter-question technique was not only a defense against hostile interrogation, it was a filter, a way of determining whether the asker was genuinely prepared to follow the logic wherever it led. They weren't. And so they got nothing. Now read Luke 23:9. This one is different from all the others. Herod Antipas has wanted to see Jesus for a long time. Luke tells us this explicitly. When Jesus is finally brought before him, after his arrest, as part of the series of hearings before his crucifixion, Herod is genuinely excited. Luke says he questioned Jesus at some length, and Jesus gave him nothing. Luke's Greek is precise, oden apekrinato auto. He answered him nothing, not a counter-question, not a parable, not a conditional response, just silence, complete silence. This is the silence that should stop you, because Herod here is not a Pharisee constructing a theological trap. He is a political ruler. Yes, but Luke goes out of his way to tell you that Herod was curious, even eager. He wanted to witness something real. And Jesus gives him total silence. Why? The early church commentators had theories. Some said Herod had killed John the Baptist, and therefore forfeited his right to divine speech. Some said Jesus recognized that Herod's curiosity was spectacle-seeking, not faith-seeking. Some said the silence was a form of judgment, a withdrawal of the divine word from someone who had repeatedly refused to listen to it when it came freely. All of those interpretations may be true simultaneously. But here is the layer that almost every sermon skips. Herod's response to the silence is to mock Jesus and dress him in an elegant robe and send him back to Pilate. Luke 23:11. And then Luke adds a detail that seems throwaway, but isn't. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other, for before this they had been enemies. The silence of Jesus healed a political rivalry between two powerful men. Not because Jesus said anything, because he said nothing. His silence created a shared experience of contempt that bridged their enmity. That is one of the strangest secondary effects in the entire gospel narrative. And it happened in the space left by an answer that was never given. 33 words in Luke's account. And in those 33 words, more is communicated, theologically, politically, humanly, than in most sermons preached on the passage. And then there is the silence before Pilate, John 19:9. Pilate brings Jesus back inside the praetorium and asks him a single sincere question. Where do you come from? Jesus does not answer him. Pilate responds with what sounds like irritation, but is probably closer to fear. Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And then Jesus does speak, but not to answer the question. He speaks to correct Pilate's theology of power. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Not, I come from Galilee. Not, I come from God. He deflects the question entirely and addresses a different issue, the source of authority, that Pilate didn't ask about. The question, where do you come from, goes unanswered, deliberately, completely. Here is what all of these silences share. In every case, the person asking was not prepared to receive the true answer. The Pharisees were not prepared to follow the implications of Jesus' authority. Herod was not prepared to move from curiosity to commitment. Pilate was not prepared to act on whatever Jesus might reveal about his origins. And Jesus, apparently, would rather say nothing than give a true answer to someone who would use it as information rather than invitation. That word, in the original Greek tradition, matters here. The root of aletheia, truth, is related not to accuracy, but to alethes, that which is not hidden. Truth, in this framework, is not data. It is disclosure. It is something that opens a relationship, not closes an argument. And a disclosure given to someone who will use it to close down relationship is not truth. It is ammunition. Jesus understood this, and so he held his tongue. There is a version of this story that lives much closer to home than ancient Judea. Most people who have walked with faith for more than a few years know what it is to ask a question and hear nothing back. Not the theatrical silence of a divine being making a theological point. The ordinary silence of a life that keeps moving after a prayer, a hospital visit, a funeral, a failed marriage, a child who didn't come home. The silence that follows the question you were always told God would answer if you asked with enough faith. Why is this happening? Why now? Why this person? Why me? The questions Jesus refused to answer are not just historical artifacts of first-century Palestinian religious debate. They are a map. They tell you something about the architecture of divine silence that has everything to do with the silence you have felt in your own life. Because look at who Jesus did answer. He answered the Roman centurion who walked up to him and said, "My servant is paralyzed and in terrible suffering." No theological question, just a man with a need and an implied request. Jesus heals him in Matthew 8, immediately, without a counter-question, without a parable, without a condition. He answered blind Bartimaeus, who sat on the side of the road and shouted his name. No question about authority, no trap, just a man who knew what he needed and refused to be quiet about it. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asks. Bartimaeus says, "I want to see." And he sees. Mark 10, 51-52. He answered the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, who didn't even ask directly, who just touched the edge of his cloak. She didn't ask, she reached. And he turned around and found her and said, "Your faith has healed you." Ulu. The pattern is coming into focus. Jesus gave silence to people asking questions designed to control, test, humiliate, or position. He gave answers, sometimes immediate, sometimes overwhelming, to people presenting needs. This is not a small distinction. This is a theology of prayer. There is a kind of prayer that is designed to get God to confirm what we have already decided, to validate a choice we've made, to endorse a position we've taken, to give us leverage in an argument we're already having. This is not prayer. This is the Pharisees in the temple court, and Jesus apparently meets it with the same quiet he showed them. But there is another kind of prayer, the kind that comes when you are out of options and out of arguments, the kind that doesn't know what to ask for except help, the kind that just reaches. That prayer, the Gospels suggest, gets a different response. The hemorrhaging woman didn't understand the theology of ritual purity. She was violating it by being in that crowd and touching a rabbi. Bartimaeus didn't have the correct formula. The centurion was a Gentile occupier who technically had no right to the promises of the covenant. And yet, we are all the hemorrhaging woman at some point. We are all reaching for something we can barely see, with methods we're not sure are correct, with faith that might be more desperation than doctrine. And the gospel narrative, read carefully, suggests that this kind of reaching, inarticulate, desperate, improper by the standards of formal theology, is exactly the kind of approach to which God responds. The questions that go unanswered are not the questions of need, they are the questions of control. There is an older tradition in Christian spirituality that speaks of what the mystics called silentium Dei, the silence of God. John of the Cross wrote about it in the 16th century. The Desert Fathers encountered it in the 4th. They did not describe it as divine absence. They described it as a form of divine presence so complete that the ordinary channels of communication become insufficient to contain it. That may sound abstract in a way that feels remote from real suffering. It isn't. What John of the Cross observed, and what the Gospel silences corroborate, is that divine silence tends to arrive at exactly the moment when a person is transitioning from religion as a system of information to religion as a relationship of trust. And relationships of trust cannot be built on answers. They can only be built on presence. A parent with a small child does not explain everything, not because the parent is withholding information, but because some realities cannot be received by someone who is not yet in a position to hold them. The parent shows up. The parent stays. The parent carries. The silence is not absence. The silence is a different mode of being present. This is, to be clear, not a comfortable explanation. It does not make grief easier. It does not make silence feel like company. The gospel does not promise that the silence will feel like anything good while you are in it. But it does suggest something about what the silence is not. It is not evidence of abandonment. It is not evidence that the question was wrong to ask. And it is not evidence that there is no answer. It is evidence, possibly, that the answer, given directly, would destroy the very thing it was supposed to build. But here is the detail that changes everything about this story, everything we have seen so far. The silence before the Pharisees, the counter-question about John's baptism, the total silence before Herod, the refusal to answer Pilate's question about origins, all of it fits a single coherent pattern. Jesus does not answer questions from people who are not prepared to be changed by the answer. That pattern holds all the way to the night of his arrest. In Gethsemane, in the high priest's courtyard, through the preliminary hearings, through the transfer to Pilate and then to Herod and back, he's mostly silent. He speaks occasionally to correct theology, not to answer questions. He does not perform for Herod. He does not justify himself to Pilate. And then the high priest asks the question, Mark 14:61. Caiaphas looks at him and says, in what is the most direct and unambiguous question put to Jesus in any of the four Gospels? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus answers, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Straight, unambiguous. No counter-question, no parable, no strategic silence. The two words in Mark's Greek are among the most significant in the New Testament, eimi, I am. The same words used in John 8:58 when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Words that carry the weight of the divine name itself, the name God spoke to Moses at the burning bush. He had refused to answer kings. He had refused to answer the crowds who pressed him for signs. He had refused to answer Pilate's sincere question about where he came from. But when the high priest of Israel, in a formal judicial hearing, asks him directly whether he is the Messiah, he answers completely, without hedging. And the answer is the thing that condemns him to death. Caiaphas tears his clothes. The council votes for death. Within hours, Jesus is before Pilate again, now heading toward crucifixion. Think about what this means. He chose silence when silence would protect him, when his silence was safe or relatively safe, or at least ambiguous enough to be survivable. He used it. And when his answer would cost him everything, when speaking the truth meant certain death. That is the only moment in the Passion narrative where he answers directly. This is not the behavior of someone who was silent because he was afraid. This is the behavior of someone who was silent because he was waiting for the exact right question. The question that deserved a full answer. The question that could bear the weight of the truth. And the only question that could bear that weight was the question that would kill him. Now go back and look at every silence with that frame. When he wrote in the dust, instead of answering the Pharisees about the woman caught in adultery, he was protecting a human being from a process designed to destroy her, not save her. His silence redirected a legal trap into a pastoral encounter. When he counter-questioned the chief priests about John's baptism, he was refusing to let them use his authority as a weapon against the people who followed him. His silence protected the community. When he said nothing before Herod, he was refusing to perform for someone who wanted spectacle without transformation. His silence refused to let faith become entertainment. When he didn't answer Pilate's question about his origins, he was redirecting toward the theological truth that mattered more than biographical information. His silence prioritized eternity over data. And then, when the direct question came, the question about identity itself, the question that had been hovering over every debate, every healing, every parable for 3 years, he answered, fully, finally, at the cost of his life. The silence wasn't absence. The silence was waiting for the right question, and in the design of the story, the right question is the one that only costs you everything to answer. Here is everything the Gospels record about the questions Jesus refused to answer. 8 documented silences. Counter-questions aimed at Pharisees. Total silence before a curious king. Deflection before a Roman governor. Words written in the dust of the temple floor. A double refusal that became an act of pastoral mercy, unlike anything in the ancient world. And one answer, at the worst possible moment, at the highest possible cost, with the simplest possible words, I am. What do you do with that if you are standing in your own silence right now? If you have asked the question and heard nothing, and you are starting to wonder whether heaven is listening at all. The gospel narrative suggests this. The silence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence that the question has not yet arrived at the form that can be answered, not because God is withholding information, but because some truths cannot be received until the receiver is ready to let the truth change everything. The Pharisees were not ready. Herod was not ready. Pilate was not ready. But somewhere in the dark, in a garden, in the hours before his arrest, Jesus himself prayed a question that went unanswered. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. It was not possible. The silence was total, and he walked forward anyway. That is the shape of what divine silence looks like from the inside, not as a philosophical concept, as a lived reality. He asked. He heard nothing. He stood up. He walked into the city. That's everything the Gospels tell us about the questions Jesus refused to answer. 8 silences, 1 answer, and 2,000 years of people sitting in the space between them, learning, slowly, how to walk forward when heaven goes quiet. Somehow. That's enough. If this opens something in you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe. We'll be here, digging into the territory the church forgot to map.